Okay, I went off in a pretty long digression there, but let's go back to McClellan. Okay, so McClellan gets to the gates of Richmond. There's a very significant battle, what we call the Battle of the 7 Days, a very complicated campaign. You hardcore military folks can read about it on your own. It's actually really interesting. It's just, like I've said a bunch, it's tough to teach the detail of battles in a course such as this. And I kind of want to give you a bigger picture of the Civil War and let you fill out the details on your own. Lee comes onto the scene. One of the things that's interesting is Robert E. Lee of Virginia, who's like the iconic commander of the Confederate forces. He doesn't become commander of the Confederate forces until May-June of 1862, almost a year after the war begins. I'm always surprised about that. It takes him a while. But anyway, Davis plugs him in, and in a brilliant series of offensive moves, Lee, who you know could kind of look into McClellan's soul and see the hesitation, he threw McClellan back from the gates of Richmond. And ultimately, McClellan is forced, he tumbles down the peninsula, and ultimately his army retreats all the way back to Washington, D.C. So this puts us into, what, July of 1862. Now, so here's the significance of this. Number one, if McClellan somehow had taken Richmond and somehow the Confederacy had surrendered, and it's unclear even if McClellan had taken Richmond in May-June of 1862. I said 1861. We're in 1862 now. Even if McClellan had won, or if he had won, I should say, it's pretty clear, and the Confederates had surrendered. Okay, if McClellan had won, if the Confederacy had surrendered, it's pretty clear that Lincoln would have let the states of the Confederacy, which of course were all slave states, would have let them back into the Union with slavery. In fact, there doesn't really seem to be any doubt about it. Okay, but he doesn't win. That's the key point. And because he doesn't win, Lincoln is facing a crisis. The war is not going well in the Eastern Theater. This is a humiliating defeat, not only for McClellan, but for Lincoln as well. McClellan gets to the gates of Virginia, but he's pushed back by Robert E. Lee, and he ends up taking his army, putting them back on the boats, those 400 boats, and sailing them back up to Washington, D.C. So it's a major defeat for McClellan. The Confederacy lives, but slavery dies. And the reason for this is that Lincoln now realizes by July of 62, he's facing a crisis, a major crisis. There's a crisis in public opinion about how the war is going, especially in the East. It's unclear if the Union can defeat the Confederacy. There's a lot of discontent in the North. The other thing is that Lincoln has been pushed from the beginning of the war by more pro-abolitionist Northerners. And let me stress this technical point, which is really significant. Remember, when the South, those 11 states of the South left the Union, they took their representatives with them. So during the Civil War, there's no Texans in the Senate. There's no Texans in the House of Representatives. It's only the only states that remained in the Union were in Congress. And these states, especially in the further north, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, were controlled by the Republican Party. So in essence, here's the shorthand way of thinking about this. The Republican Party dominates the U.S. government. During the Civil War and in the years after the Civil War, the Republican Party is more powerful, has more of a say in running the federal government than any one party has ever had before or since in U.S. history. And you could say that it's the Republican Party that's waging war on the Confederacy. And how is it doing that? It's because the Republican Party controls the U.S. federal government. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about what's going on during the Civil War and afterwards. The federal government, the U.S. state, when I talk about state, I'm talking about the federal government. It means the same thing, is now in the hands of the Republican Party. And what you have is Republicans, for the most part anyway, are determined to see the Civil War to its very end. They're not going to give up, is what I mean. They're not going to surrender. They're not going to let the South go on its merry way. Now, what's interesting also about this is the Republican Party is split between moderates and more radicals. And that's not so really hard to think about party splits in 2016. Think about Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, or Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. We live in a campaign period where we're seeing splits really more than almost we've ever seen in the two political parties. And the Republican Party, which the Democratic Party doesn't go out of business. The Democratic Party still has a presence in the North. But the federal government's dominated by the Republican Party during this period. And so what you have is more radical Republicans who are more anti-slavery, who want to push the war harder, who want to abolish slavery. And you have more moderate Republicans that are slower to move towards emancipation. And Abraham Lincoln is a great example of one of these moderate Republicans. As I've said many, many times, when he's elected, he tells the South he's not going to touch slavery. He's just not going to let it expand. But what happens is the events force Lincoln's hand. During the first months of the war, Lincoln goes to great lengths to assure the South that he's not going to free the slaves. I talked about this on Monday. Strategically, it would have been a disaster because freeing the slaves too early would have pushed Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland. Well, Maryland, actually, Lincoln had pretty good control of. But if Lincoln had issued an Emancipation Proclamation in the first 6 months of the Civil War, it would have pushed Kentucky and Missouri into the Confederate camp, and Lincoln thought that would have ended the Civil War with a Union defeat. But by the summer of '62, although things aren't going well in Virginia, Lincoln has, and the Union and the Republicans have a very firm control over Kentucky and Missouri, so that's no longer a variable. Lincoln can end slavery without worrying about it too much. Or worrying about losing Kentucky or Missouri. The other thing is that the more radical, what we call radical Republicans, are pushing Lincoln to abolish slavery. They're saying, look, we've got to make this war a war of emancipation. I've talked about this. It's not just the radicals that are pushing, so-called radicals. When I'm in the Civil War kind of nomenclature, a radical is someone who is more anti-slavery. So it's not just the radicals that are pushing Lincoln. As I talked about before, common Union soldiers, the enlisted men, are starting to realize very quickly that, as you know, these are the folks with boots on the ground, if I can use that kind of phrase that we use these days. They realize very quickly that it will be impossible to defeat the Confederacy without ending slavery. And it's not a moral question. Most Union soldiers, sad to say, were deeply racist. It's just the slaves were the Southern infrastructure, the labor infrastructure of the South. You can't defeat an enemy like the South, which is a very potent enemy, without undermining its infrastructure. So Lincoln, who keeps a very, very close ear to the ground, he used to actually say what he would do these public opinion baths. He would actually walk around, which is hard. Well, that's probably why he got shot, right? But he read the newspapers. He would talk to as many people as possible. And by the summer of 62, he senses that there's a shift among white Northerners over the question of emancipation. That something that no whites had wanted, and when the war began, more and more Northern whites are starting to see that emancipation is necessary. Again, for most whites, it's not for moral reasons, it's for military reasons. That the only way you're going to defeat the Confederacy is by taking away its labor force. Also, African Americans who have a small voice in this, freed African Americans, they're saying, like Frederick Douglass, he's saying to fight against the slaveholders without fighting against slavery is but a half-hearted business and paralyzes the hands engaged in it. So Lincoln is starting to he's starting to sense very strongly by the summer of 1862 that there's been a shift in the wind, that there is a space, so to speak, that is opened up among Northern whites that is allows them to think about the possibility and even the necessity for emancipation. This is extraordinary when you think about it. You know, when you think about how deeply rooted slavery was in U.S. life, both North and South, it's extraordinary how the move towards emancipation, the acceleration in the move toward emancipation between April of 61 and July of 62. In 1 year, you have more of a move towards emancipation than you had in the previous 300 years of U.S. history, if you also think about the U.S. being a colonial possession of Great Britain. So there's this tremendous acceleration and an opening of a space that Lincoln sees. He sees that it's there, that will allow, he thinks now, by the summer of 62, as he's kind of despairing about McClellan's defeat, he's thinking Lincoln starts to become open to the idea of emancipation. And again, he'd always hated slavery, but he was willing to let it exist. But now he thinks, well, you know what? Maybe I can kill two birds with one stone. I've always hated slavery, but I didn't want to move too quickly to end it. But now I can make an argument that I have to end slavery because it's a military necessity. That it's not a moral necessity, it's a military necessity. That we can't defeat the South, the U.S. can't defeat the South without at the same time freeing the slaves.